Alright, I'm quite excited to discuss this today. I'm going to be discussing the fourth meditation of Ibn Husserl's Cartesian meditations. I have a copy of that on my Kindle app of my iPad of which is what I'm using to film this, otherwise I would read passages for you. But I do have notes here which I'm going to discuss this with, hopefully well enough. So I guess what I'd like to kind of discuss in this whole thing is the fourth meditation is kind of developing a lot of concept of the transcendental ego of Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. So the fourth meditation is the second to last one. The fifth one is the final one, and in that meditation, which is actually pretty long, and I might do that one in a couple parts. When I finally do that one, that one kind of goes in. It goes into a lot about intersubjectivity and about experience of the other. Since for him, essence is prior to existence, and he has this sphere of originality, which is the transcendental ego, and that you go from yourself to the other. When for Heidegger and others, which follow him, it's more of a other to self kind of direction. So, section number 30. Well, first of all, the whole thing is about the development of constitutional problems pertaining to the TE, which the TE is the transcendental ego, which is what I will call that, so I don't have to say that from here on out. So the TE is the transcendental ego. Section 30 is about the process of life for the TE. Objects exist as actual and possible consciousnesses. So the ego, you have things that we interact with, and that's, a actual consciousness while I have a lot of other things around me which I could interact with, which are possible consciousnesses. So in this way, we are kind of doing a constitutional investigation. So I guess I've explained in many videos the kind of static versus genetic phenomenology split, where a static phenomenology, which we talk about noesis, noema, hyle, and also intentionality, while with transcendental phenomenology, we're kind of moving towards, we're talking about phenomenology in a more of a genetic fashion, or a constitutional fashion, where we're kind of trying to get more down to the root as to how it's given, or pre-givenness itself. Where in static phenomenology we kind of discuss givenness itself. Genetic phenomenology or constitutional phenomenology, we're kind of discussing the pre-givenness or the genesis of itself, the genesis of consciousness itself, the genesis of the phenomena, if you will. So the TE is what it is by intentional objectivities. So the sphere of immanent time and world objects. So the TE is what it is by what it interacts with. What it interacts with makes it who it is, because when I interact with a given object, I'm interacting with a intentional objectivity. I'm kind of, this is a objectivity which I am engaging in a intentional interaction with, and hopefully you know what the intentionality of phenomenology is. Section 31. The ego is the ego is the identical pole of subjective processes. The TE is existence for himself in continuous evidence, and constitutes himself as existing. The ego is a stream of consciousness, or the flowing cogito, and also posits himself as an I. So you have two poles. the ego pole, and when I have this object, say this is any object, there's two poles here, and this somewhat of what he calls a synthetic unity, or a subjective unity, where this is a way, in a way, this is a objectivity, because of, how it's kind of hard to explain, but I've explained it in many videos before, how this phenomenological applique, and how it's not a purely subjective idealistic experience or thing. It's not purely objective, because we can't really investigate into either of those fields, so we kind of do the bracketing or the parenthesizing or the applique, where we're going to recognize this as a thing that does exist for me. So for the ego, it is a intentional objectivity. So you recognize how there's two poles here, and that creates a synthetic unity, or a subject unity. Section 32, the ego is the substrate of habitualities. The ego is not an empty pole of identity. So we have transcendental generation. Acts emanate from the ego, and the ego through that acquires new abiding properties. So a habituality is I am of such a conviction. So a conviction, or is like a opinion, values or volitions or decisions. So among all these things that the ego deals with, he develops habitualities. So it's not like we have this empty ego which interacts with all these things via this stream of consciousness, or this flowing cogito. We have one that has habitualities, thus ideas, volitions, values, and convictions. So in a way, that's how he is the things that he interacts with. So this is a abiding habitus or state, or the decision to abide in something. A fleeting act causing decision passes. Abiding decision remains. So while we have the act comes and goes, but the thing that there's something that is left behind by that. What the ego does changes him. We have this substrate of habitualities. The ego constitutes himself as an identical substrate of ego properties. Section 33. So hopefully you're all getting this. If you have a question, please comment below, because if I went into distinct and very detailedness of all these things, that this video would be way longer than it is already going to be. Section 33, we have the full concretion of the ego as a monad. So he kind of brings in the concept of a monad. Now, the first concept of monad came from, of course, Leibniz. Leibniz's monad was where a monad is basically a mental being of any one person that is not concrete and is not extended either. I do have a video about Leibniz's monadology that I did earlier this year, I think. And for Leibniz, one's monad is his mental entity, and it is not extended, nor is it concrete. It's not being it's basically almost, you would call it a spiritual being, but it can interact in a variety of ways in its own plane. So the ego taken in full concreteness is the monad for Husserl. The ego's concrete or multiformity of intentional life. The ego is the world that exists for it, abiding acquisitions, recognizing previous acquaintances, its habitual life. Explicate phenomenologically. So we kind of trying to explicate phenomenologically the monadic ego, and that's doing that explication of the monadic ego is doing genetic or constitutional phenomenology. So, how to better put that and better understand the monad, the monadic ego for Husserl. The monad is not this empty thing that is the stream of consciousness. It's more has, like he says, abiding acquisitions, recognizing previous acquaintances, and its habitual life. And in a way, what it experiences becomes intentional objectivities and makes him who he is. It makes the monad what it is. So it is a full thing, really. Section 34, fundamental development of phenomenological method, transcendental analysis of the as eidetic. So, problems of phenomenological genesis is genetic phenomenology. Renewed meditation concerning phenomenological method. That's really what that is. The eidetic description of this, we have new realm or new method of empirical description. Intentional uncovering of my monad. That's what this phenomenological method of investigation is. So what are the intentional processes? What are they? Talking about gnosis, noma, etc., but going beyond that also. Perception, perception here is still perception of something because it's intentional. Fantasy, Phantasy, not accepting something as being entirely the as if. So, saying you have a dream and you don't realize that that's fake, you don't realize that it's an as if issue, that it's not intentionally objective. So we have factualness versus fantasiableness. I never seen that word before, but then I wrote it like a month ago. We have essential analysis here, conscious of something, the possible versus the apodictic, the apodictic or the universal, factual versus fantasy. The eidetic ego is apodictic, universal, essential, and has possibilities. This is the nexus horizon. Phenomenology of a priori method according to eidetic method. Eidetic phenomenology explores the a priori. So that's where we're getting to a more of a genetic kind of investigation. So eidetic phenomenology, and eidetic phenomenology has to do with eidos, or the essences, and that is where he's kind of thinking that we can get beyond that towards more of a genetic phenomenology. A sphere of oneness, no other ego possibility or actuality is presupposed. So the transcendental is also the eidetic. Section 35. Not much longer. Eidetic intentional psychology. So positive science is psychology. Ego psychology is eidetic phenomenology. So there's sort of a psychological element in this, where, in a way, we are trying to investigate what goes on in those sort of conscious processes. And we do have a bit of a discussion about time here in section 37, and I skipped 36. Time ecological genesis. The ego. Time. We have past, present, and future. Now, the big book for this, Husserl's Phenomenology, is Husserl's Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness. That's the book which, if you want to discuss time consciousness through Husserl's thought process, then it's that book. And you will see this in this as well as some other of his works. So, these notions of past, present, and future are constituted and posited over and over again. They are universal laws of genesis for the ego. And in a way, the time factor does have a bit of a place in kind of whether we're doing static or genetic phenomenology. Section 38, active and passive genesis. So active genesis, that's that the ego functions as productively constitutive, using practical reason, subjective processes that are acts of the ego. Passive genesis, constitutions of objective gives prior to all activity. So this is kind of like association, like how the highlight, we have nosis, noma, and highlight. Highlight is background constraints that brings everything, even though if I'm looking at this remote, I'm having a nosis and a noma in this intentional experience. Well, how can I understand this were it not for everything else around it? Everything that is background and constraining, which kind of, allows for this one thing to occur. So passive genesis is that all these things, while I'm having active genesis with a certain thing through this one process, there's a lot of other things which are, through these conscious processes, are brought together in their certain ways, in a intentionally objective way. That's all together, and that's how that's prior to my looking at this one thing right now. Categorical intuition, which is something given in objectivity. So, and that's in a way what goes on here, and we try to in genetic phenomenology we try to figure what's prior to my intentionally experiencing that. Section 39, the principle of association, which kind of talks about the principle of association and how that works with passive genesis. Section 40, transcendental idealism. Phenomenology as transcendental theory of is a transcendental theory of knowledge. My sphere of consciousness is what exists for me. That's kind of in a way how this is thought of as idealism, transcendental idealism. How does phenomenology have objective significance? So how, given all this stuff, how does it have objective significance, and how is it not just a idealism? And the truth there is that the things that are experienced intentionally are the only things that can be verified and can be investigated. Therefore, that is how they are made objective, and yet they are subjective at the same time. Now, there are better ways of explaining that. So, if you have a question and you think that something should be more thoroughly explained here, tell me, and I will. I mean, that's. And also, if you think I've messed something up or explained something wrong here, also comment below, because that's kind of the reason I do these, is because I want to get better at my understanding of things, and if I do help someone in the process, great, but I do have a concern with my own understanding here, and I want to better that. So, section 41, which is the final one of this meditation. Okay, for the last section, which is section 41 of this meditation, about genuine phenomenological explication of one's ego cogito as transcendental idealism, which can be thought of as thus, because what is the rightness of accepting anything here as objectively valid? Where, given this, we could think of it as being subjective or idealistic, because when we're talking about a ego and the flow of the cogito and talking about this subjective thing going on here, where it can be thought of as idealistic, because how can we verify anything as objectively valid if all we have is subjective stuff? Now, given the epoche and given all of the stuff that Husserl has given, we know that we can't really investigate into things purely subjective and into investigate as to whether they are that or not, and we can't really investigate into things whether they are purely realistically objective or not. But anything that is subjective is really all we have to work with. Therefore, that is all we have to give as objectively valid. So, what exists in ego is constitutional in himself. Transcendental subjectivity is the universe of possible sense. Transcendental idealism is, in a new sense, transcendental phenomenology. So, hopefully, you're kind of getting how this whole meditation is a bit of a development of the transcendental ego, and about genetic phenomenology and transcendental phenomenology, and as to how this investigation is supposed to work, and also, how a ego is who he is by what he experiences intentionally, and how that all works. So if you think I've messed something up or left something out or explained something incorrectly, comment below. Or if you have a question or you want something more coherently explained, then also comment below. If I did go into everything in deep detail, this video could be an hour long. So I highly recommend that you buy that book or check it out from your library and read it, because I think it's a great work in phenomenology. Thank you.